I never imagined I would measure my worth to my own parents in dollars, but that's exactly what happened when I was 36 years old, lying on a thin hospital bed with a paper gown sticking to my back and fear crawling up my spine. The doctor had used careful words, the kind meant to soften the blow, but the truth landed heavy anyway. The surgery wasn't optional. It wasn't cosmetic. It wasn't something I could pray away or postpone until next year. Without it, my quality of life would decline fast, and there were risks that scared me enough to keep me awake at night. The problem wasn't the surgery itself. It was the $5,000 my insurance wouldn't cover, the amount I needed up front before they would even schedule me. $5,000 might as well have been $50,000 at that point in my life. I worked full-time, lived modestly, and still barely stayed ahead of rent, utilities, and the quiet emergencies that always seemed to show up at the worst times. I remember sitting in my car after that appointment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the panic, telling myself that my parents would help. Of course they would. They always said family comes first. They owned their home outright, traveled twice a year, and never missed a chance to remind us how responsible they were with money. Asking them felt humiliating, but it also felt reasonable. This wasn't a vacation or a bad investment. This was my body. This was my future. I rehearsed the conversation a dozen times before I finally drove to their house, the same house I grew up in, the same driveway where I learned to ride a bike and scraped my knees. Walking up to their front door, I felt like a child again, hoping for comfort, expecting protection. We sat at the kitchen table, the smell of coffee in the air, sunlight hitting the old clock on the wall. I told them everything, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. I explained the diagnosis, the surgery, the risks, and finally, the number, $5,000. I promised I would pay it back, even though part of me believed parents didn't keep score when it came to something like this. My mother's face tightened first. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. There was a pause that stretched too long, and in that silence, I felt something slipping away. My father cleared his throat and said they had to think about their retirement. My mother nodded and added that medical bills were a slippery slope, that once they helped once, where would it end? I stared at them, waiting for the punchline, for the moment they would soften and say of course they were kidding. But it never came. Instead, my father said something I still hear in my sleep. He said, "You're an adult now. You need to figure this out on your own." I tried to explain again, more quietly this time, that I had figured everything else out, that I just needed help with this one thing, this one time. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand, the way you might comfort a stranger, and said she was sorry, truly sorry, but they couldn't. I left their house in a fog, the world feeling muted and unreal. I cried in my car until my chest hurt, not just because of the surgery, but because something fundamental had cracked. It wasn't the money alone. It was the realization that when it really mattered, when I was scared and vulnerable, they chose their comfort over my health. For days after that, I spiraled. I looked into loans with brutal interest rates. I considered credit cards I knew I'd never crawl out from under. I even thought about postponing the surgery and pretending everything was fine, even though the doctor had warned me against it. During all of this, I didn't tell my younger brother, Marcus. We had grown up in the same house, but our paths couldn't have been more different. I was the responsible one, the steady one, the one who followed the rules. Marcus was the dreamer, the risk-taker, the one who always seemed one paycheck away from disaster. He worked 2 jobs, neither of them glamorous, and still struggled. Our parents worried about him constantly, often using him as a cautionary tale when they talked to me. "Don't be like your brother," they'd say. I loved Marcus fiercely, but I also knew he had nothing to give, so I kept my mouth shut. Somehow, he found out anyway. He showed up at my apartment one evening with takeout and that familiar crooked smile, asking why I sounded weird on the phone lately. I tried to brush it off, but he saw right through me. When I finally told him, everything spilled out, including what our parents had said. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with something that looked like anger and heartbreak combined. When I finished, I felt embarrassed, exposed, like I'd said too much. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then he stood up and started pacing my living room. He muttered something under his breath about priorities and family, and then he stopped in front of me and said, "How much do you need?" I laughed, a sharp, broken sound, and told him not to worry about it. I told him I'd figure it out. He didn't smile back. He just said, "I asked how much." When I told him the number, $5,000, his shoulders sagged for a split second, just long enough for me to see the weight of it. Then he nodded like he'd made a decision. He told me to give him a few days. I protested, told him not to do anything stupid, not to put himself in a hole for me. He waved me off and hugged me, tight and familiar, smelling like grease and cheap cologne. "You're my sister," he said simply. "That's not stupid." I didn't believe him. I assumed he'd looked at his bank account, realized what I already knew, and let it go. 3 days later, he called me early in the morning and told me to check my account. I remember my hands shaking as I opened my banking app, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There it was, $5,000, every penny I needed, sitting there like a miracle I didn't deserve. I called him immediately, my voice breaking as I asked what he had done. He tried to joke it off at first, but when I pushed, he admitted the truth. He had emptied his savings. He had sold his old motorcycle, the one thing he loved that made his long days feel bearable. He'd borrowed a little from a friend and picked up extra overnight shifts, all so I wouldn't have to wait. I felt overwhelmed with gratitude and guilt, both crashing into me at once. I told him I couldn't accept it, that it wasn't fair, that he needed that money more than I did. He got quiet then, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but firm. He said, "I can make more money. I can't make another you." I hung up and cried harder than I had since the doctor's office, because in that moment I understood something my parents had never taught me. Love isn't about comfort or security or preserving what you have. Love is about sacrifice. Love is about showing up when it costs you something. I scheduled the surgery that same day. As the date approached, my parents called, cheerful and oblivious, asking how I was doing. I didn't tell them where the money came from. Part of me wanted to protect Marcus. Part of me wanted to protect myself from their reaction. On the morning of the surgery, Marcus was there, sitting beside my bed, cracking jokes, pretending not to be scared. When they wheeled me into the operating room, the last thing I saw was his face, pale but determined, and I knew no matter how this turned out, I would never forget what he'd done for me. When I woke up from the surgery, the first thing I noticed was the dull, spreading ache in my body, the kind that tells you something deep has been rearranged. The second thing I noticed was Marcus sitting in the chair beside my bed, his head tilted back against the wall, mouth slightly open, fast asleep. For a second, I just watched him breathe. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond missing a night's sleep. It was the exhaustion of someone who had given more than they could afford and didn't regret it, even for a moment. A nurse noticed I was awake and gently called his name. He startled, rubbed his face, and when he saw my eyes open, he smiled so wide it made my chest hurt more than the incision. He reached for my hand carefully, like he was afraid he might break me, and asked how I felt. I told him I was sore but okay, and he nodded, relief washing over him in waves. He stayed with me as long as they would let him, asking questions, making sure I understood the aftercare instructions, joking with the nurses until they laughed. He acted like this was all normal, like of course he would be there, like of course he would do whatever it took. That was Marcus. The first few days of recovery were a blur of pain medication, short walks down the hallway, and long hours staring at the ceiling of my apartment once I was discharged. Marcus moved into my living room without asking, sleeping on the couch, cooking meals that were mostly edible, and reminding me to take my meds on time. Every time I thanked him, he brushed it off, but I could see the toll it was taking. He was working extra shifts, coming home late, smelling like sweat and oil, his eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. Once I overheard him on the phone with a creditor, his voice low and apologetic, promising to send something soon. Guilt gnawed at me constantly. I told myself I'd pay him back as soon as I could, that this was temporary, but a small, ugly part of me wondered why my parents hadn't even offered to help with groceries or a ride. They called occasionally, asking vague questions about my health, offering thoughts and prayers, as if that closed the gap between what they could have done and what they chose not to do. A week into my recovery, my mother announced they wanted to come visit. My stomach twisted at the thought, but I agreed. Part of me still hoped, foolishly, that seeing me like this would change something, that they would feel remorse. They arrived with a bouquet of flowers and a bag of fruit, fussing over my pillows and commenting on how pale I looked. Marcus stayed in the kitchen, giving us space, but I could feel his presence like a steady anchor. At one point, my father asked how I'd managed to get the surgery scheduled so quickly. There was a casual curiosity in his voice that made my hands clench under the blanket. I told them the truth then. I told them Marcus had paid for it. I watched their faces change in real time. My mother's eyes widened, my father frowned, a line appearing between his brows. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then my mother said, "Oh, he really shouldn't have done that." Not "thank you," not "we're proud of him," just that. My father added that Marcus needed to learn responsibility, that bailing people out wasn't healthy. Something inside me snapped, quiet but final. I told them he hadn't bailed me out of a bad decision, he'd saved my health. I told them that while they were protecting their retirement fund, their son had sold his motorcycle and emptied his savings without hesitation. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I told them I would never forget who showed up for me. The room went cold. My mother looked wounded. My father looked annoyed. They left shortly after, saying they didn't want to tire me out. When the door closed behind them, Marcus came out of the kitchen. He tried to apologize, said he hadn't meant to cause trouble. I grabbed his hand and told him he had nothing to apologize for. If anything, I should have spoken up sooner. Recovery took longer than I expected. There were setbacks, nights when the pain flared and I wondered if it had all been worth it. Every time doubt crept in, Marcus was there, reminding me why we did this, reminding me I was healing. As I got stronger, I started planning how to repay him. I cut every unnecessary expense, picked up freelance work I could do from bed, and put every extra dollar aside. Marcus never asked about the money, he never hinted, but I saw the overdue notices on the counter, the way he hesitated before buying groceries. One evening, about 2 months after the surgery, I handed him an envelope with my first repayment. It wasn't much, but it was something. He looked at it like it was a strange object, then sighed and smiled softly. He told me he appreciated it, but that I didn't need to rush. That sentence alone told me everything about the difference between him and our parents. For them, money was leverage. For him, it was a tool, something meant to be used when it mattered. As my health improved, my perspective shifted. I stopped calling my parents as often. When they reached out, the conversation stayed polite but shallow. They sensed the distance and didn't know how to bridge it. Part of me grieved that loss. I mourned the parents I thought I had, the safety net I believed existed. But another part of me felt strangely free. I no longer measured myself by their approval or their version of responsibility. I started to see my childhood differently, the subtle ways they had prioritized stability over connection, appearances over empathy. Marcus and I talked about it late at night, sharing memories, piecing together how we had both learned different lessons from the same house. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sun dip below the buildings, he admitted he'd always felt like the disappointment, the one who never quite lived up to their expectations. I told him the truth then, that I had always admired his heart, even when I pretended not to. We laughed softly, the kind of laughter that comes from finally being honest. Months later, I was fully back on my feet, stronger than I'd been in years. I had repaid most of what Marcus gave me, with interest, though he insisted I didn't need to. I knew our relationship would never go back to what it was before, because it had grown into something deeper. As for my parents, the reckoning came quietly. They invited us both to dinner one night, clearly having rehearsed what they wanted to say. My mother apologized haltingly, admitting they hadn't realized how serious it was. My father said less, but he listened. I accepted their apology without absolving them. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let bitterness rot you from the inside. But trust is something else entirely. Today, when people ask me who my hero is, I don't hesitate. It's my broke brother who gave me everything when those with plenty gave me nothing. He taught me that family isn't defined by who raised you or who shares your blood, but who shows up when the cost is real. The surgery saved my body, but Marcus saved something else too. He saved my understanding of love, and that is a debt I can never fully repay. Life didn't snap back into place after that conversation with my parents. It settled slowly, like dust after something heavy has fallen. Marcus moved back into his own place once I could manage on my own, but the distance between our apartments didn't touch the closeness we'd built. We talked every day, sometimes about nothing at all, sometimes about things we'd never said out loud before. I noticed how much lighter I felt, physically and emotionally, now that the surgery was behind me. But there was also a new weight I carried, an awareness that love had been clearly demonstrated to me, and I couldn't unsee the contrast. At work, people commented on how well I looked, how strong I seemed. I smiled and thanked them, but inside I knew my recovery wasn't just medical. Something in me had healed that I hadn't even realized was wounded. I started saying no more often, setting boundaries I'd never dared to set before. When my parents called with expectations disguised as suggestions, I didn't rush to accommodate them. I listened. I chose. That alone felt revolutionary. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling in small, quiet ways. The adrenaline of my crisis had kept him going, but now reality was catching up. His hours were longer, his patience thinner. One night he showed up at my door looking defeated, shoulders slumped, eyes tired in a way that made my chest tighten. I didn't even sit down at first, just stood there like he might fall over if he stopped moving. I made him tea and waited. Eventually, he admitted he was behind on rent, not dangerously yet, but close enough to feel the pressure every time his phone buzzed. I felt a familiar surge of panic, followed by determination. This time, I was the one who had something to give. I offered to help, even temporarily, but he shook his head immediately, pride flaring up like a reflex. We argued softly, the way people do when they're both trying to protect each other. Finally, I told him that accepting help didn't erase what he'd done for me. It honored it. That seemed to land. He agreed to let me cover 1 month, just to breathe. Writing that check felt different than anything I'd ever spent money on. It wasn't fear-driven or obligatory. It was chosen. It was love in motion. Over time, Marcus stabilized. He found a slightly better-paying job, still not glamorous, but steadier. I watched him grow into a quieter confidence, less reckless, more grounded. He still joked, still dreamed, but there was a new seriousness there, a sense of self-worth he hadn't always had. I like to think what he did for me showed him something too, that he wasn't the screw-up he'd been labeled as, that his heart was his greatest asset, not his weakness. My parents remained on the periphery of my life, present but not central. Holidays were polite, conversations stayed on safe topics. They never fully addressed the surgery again, and I stopped waiting for them to. One afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly and asked if I regretted anything. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her I regretted believing that love would automatically show up when it mattered, just because it always had before. I said it gently, not to wound her, but to be honest. There was a long silence on the line. She didn't argue. That told me more than any apology could have. As the years passed, the story of my surgery became something people referenced casually, a turning point I'd survived. But for me, it remained sacred, a reminder of who I was and who I chose to keep close. Marcus and I celebrated anniversaries of small victories, his promotion, my clean bill of health. We teased each other, supported each other, and built traditions that belonged just to us. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that kitchen table, the sunlight, the way my parents had said no. The sting was still there, but it no longer defined me. It simply informed me. It taught me that generosity isn't about abundance, it's about priorities. My parents had money but guarded it fiercely. Marcus had almost nothing and gave freely. That difference reshaped my understanding of wealth. I began volunteering, donating when I could, showing up for people in ways I hadn't before, not because I was trying to prove something, but because I finally understood what mattered. When I look back now, I see that my life split into a before and after, not because of the surgery itself, but because of the choices surrounding it. I learned that being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means knowing who you can lean on and being worthy of that trust. I learned that forgiveness is complex, layered, and deeply personal. And I learned that sometimes the people you least expect will become the foundation you build your future on. Marcus never lets me forget the time he saved my life, as he likes to joke, but I always correct him. He didn't just save my life, he showed me how to live it, with courage, compassion, and an open hand. And that lesson, once learned, never leaves you. There was a moment about a year after the surgery when I realized how deeply everything had changed. It wasn't dramatic, no arguments, no revelations, just a quiet afternoon at the grocery store with Marcus, standing in the cereal aisle debating which brand was actually worth the money. He laughed and said something about how he never thought he'd be the kind of person who read price labels this closely. I laughed too, but inside, I felt something settle. We were no longer in survival mode. We were planning. We were thinking ahead. That felt like a victory. My body had healed well, better than expected, and with that came a sense of confidence I hadn't felt in years. I took on more responsibility at work, applied for a role I never would have considered before, and to my surprise, I got it. The raise wasn't enormous, but it was steady, reliable. The first thing I did after signing the offer letter was call Marcus. He whooped so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. That night, we celebrated with cheap takeout and shared dessert, sitting on the floor like we used to when we were kids. I handed him the final payment then, the last envelope, and this time he didn't argue. He just hugged me long and tight and said he was proud of me. No one had ever said that to me like that before, without conditions or comparisons. The words stayed with me. My parents found out about my promotion through Marcus, and they invited me over to dinner again. I hesitated before agreeing, weighing how much of myself I was willing to bring into that house now. When I arrived, everything looked the same, the furniture, the photos, the careful order. My mother had cooked my favorite meal, a gesture that would have meant everything to me once. We sat at the table, and conversation flowed easily enough at first. Halfway through dinner, my father mentioned my new position, congratulated me, and said something about how hard work always pays off. I nodded, but I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. I told him that yes, hard work mattered, but so did support. So did people who believed in you enough to take a risk. The table went quiet. My mother looked down at her plate. My father cleared his throat. I didn't push further. I had said what I needed to say. That night, driving home, I didn't feel angry or sad. I felt clear. There's a peace that comes from no longer needing someone to be different in order for you to move forward. Marcus and I talked about our childhood more openly after that. We compared notes, laughed at things that once hurt, acknowledged the ways we had both adapted to survive in our own ways. He told me he used to think I was the favorite, that I had it easier. I admitted I used to think he was the brave one, the one who dared to live loudly. We both realized how incomplete those stories had been. Our parents hadn't meant to harm us, not intentionally, but intention doesn't erase impact. Understanding that allowed us to release some of the resentment without excusing the behavior. Life continued, as it always does, in a mix of ordinary and extraordinary moments. Marcus eventually moved into a better apartment, one with sunlight and enough space to breathe. I helped him paint the walls, our laughter echoing through empty rooms. He started dating someone kind, someone who saw him clearly and didn't try to fix him. Watching him build a life that felt stable and chosen filled me with a quiet joy. Sometimes I caught my parents watching him at family gatherings with something like surprise, as if they were seeing him for the first time. They never said much, but I noticed the shift. Respect, once withheld, slowly earned in a way that felt both satisfying and sad. I began to understand that family stories don't always end with grand apologies or perfect reconciliation. Sometimes they end with acceptance, with adjusted expectations, with love that exists within newly drawn lines. I stopped waiting for my parents to become the people I needed them to be and started appreciating who they were capable of being now. It wasn't the same thing, but it was enough. On the anniversary of my surgery, Marcus and I started a tradition. We'd meet for breakfast, no matter what day of the week it fell on, and toast to another year, not just of my health, but of our bond. One year, as we clinked coffee mugs, he got unusually quiet. He told me he'd been scared back then, more scared than he'd ever admitted, not of losing money, but of losing me. Hearing that made my throat tighten. I told him I'd been scared too, not just of the surgery, but of finding out where I stood. We sat with that truth for a moment, letting it exist between us without trying to soften it. There's a kind of intimacy that comes from surviving something together, even if you experienced it differently. As I tell this story now, I'm aware that it could sound like a simple lesson about money or favoritism or sacrifice, but for me it was about awakening, about seeing clearly who was willing to step into discomfort for love and who wasn't, about recognizing that sometimes the richest people in your life are the ones who have the least to give, yet give anyway. My parents taught me many things, some of them valuable, but Marcus taught me the one lesson that mattered most when everything was on the line. He taught me that love is an action, not a statement, a choice, not an obligation. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. It changes how you move through the world, how you show up for others, how you measure what truly matters. That understanding became my compass, guiding decisions, big and small, reminding me of who I want to be when someone else is scared and asking for help. As time went on, I noticed how often people around me talked about family as if it were a fixed equation, something you're born into and obligated to accept exactly as it is. I used to believe that too. But after everything that happened, I began to see family more as a living relationship, something shaped by choices made over and over again. Marcus and I chose each other in a way we never had before. That choice showed up in the small things. He'd call me on his lunch break just to tell me something ridiculous that happened at work. I'd text him reminders about appointments he pretended not to forget. We celebrated each other's wins loudly and sat quietly together during the losses. There was no keeping score, no hierarchy, no unspoken competition, just mutual care. I realized how rare that was when I started dating again. I found myself paying attention to how people treated others when it cost them something, not when it was convenient. Generosity became my filter. Empathy became non-negotiable. If someone couldn't understand why my brother mattered so much to me, they didn't last long in my life. I wasn't angry about it. I was simply clear. My parents watched these changes from a distance. They commented once, cautiously, that I seemed different, stronger. I agreed. I didn't explain why. Some truths are better demonstrated than defended. One winter, my father had a health scare of his own, nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to shake him. My mother called me late one night, her voice small and afraid in a way I hadn't heard before. I went to the hospital without hesitation. Marcus came too. Sitting in that waiting room, the roles felt strangely reversed. My parents were vulnerable now, dependent on reassurance. I held my mother's hand. Marcus spoke gently to my father. There was no pettiness in either of us, no desire to withhold care as punishment. Love, once learned, doesn't easily turn off. But I did notice something else. My parents looked surprised by our presence, by how quickly we came, by how calm and steady Marcus was. Later, after my father was discharged, my mother pulled me aside and said, quietly, I didn't realize how much he'd grown. I nodded. I didn't say that he'd always been this way, that growth had simply revealed what was already there. Letting her arrive at that understanding on her own felt kinder. That experience softened something between us, but it didn't erase the past. Instead, it layered over it, adding complexity where there had once been certainty. I learned that relationships don't have to be all good or all bad to be real. They can be imperfect, evolving, constrained by history, and still meaningful. Marcus and I talked about that night afterward, sitting in my car, the engine idling. He admitted it felt strange to be the dependable one in our parents' eyes. I told him he'd earned it a long time ago. He shrugged, but I could tell it mattered. Not the recognition itself, but the sense that his actions had reshaped the narrative. Over the next couple of years, my life settled into a rhythm I was proud of. My health remained stable, my career progressed. I moved to a slightly larger place with better light and room for guests. Marcus became a regular fixture there, sometimes dropping by unannounced, sometimes staying for dinner. We didn't need invitations anymore. My parents visited occasionally, and while there were still moments of awkwardness, there was also a new respect for the boundaries I'd set. They no longer assumed access to every part of my life. Strangely, that made the time we did spend together feel more genuine. One evening, as we sat around my table, my mother mentioned money, how they were reviewing their finances again, planning carefully, as always. She said it casually, but I heard the old pride underneath it. This time, though, I didn't feel small or resentful. I simply smiled and said I was glad they felt secure. Later that night, after they left, Marcus asked if it still bothered me. I thought about it honestly before answering. I told him it didn't hurt the same way anymore. The wound had scarred over. Sensitive sometimes, but no longer open. Healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means it no longer controls you. That realization felt like another kind of recovery, quieter but just as important as the physical one. I began telling my story more openly, not for sympathy, but because I saw how often people assumed they were alone in their disappointments. Friends confided in me about their own family fractures, their own moments of clarity. Each time I thought of Marcus, of the simple, radical choice he made when I needed him most. I understood then that his generosity didn't just save me, it rippled outward, influencing how I showed up, how I listened, how I loved. And that ripple touched others in ways I'd never fully see. Sometimes, late at night, I replay that moment when I checked my bank account and saw the money there. The shock, the disbelief, the overwhelming gratitude. It remains one of the purest moments of love I've ever known. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was grounded in reality, in sacrifice, in action. That moment redefined family for me, stripping it down to its essence. Family is who steps forward when the cost is real. Everything else is just noise. There's a quiet kind of confidence that comes from knowing without question who will show up for you. I didn't always have that. For most of my life, I thought certainty came from stability, from savings accounts and long-term plans and carefully maintained appearances. After the surgery, after everything Marcus did, I learned certainty comes from people, from character, from patterns of behavior repeated even when no one is watching. That understanding changed how I moved through the world. I stopped over-explaining myself. I stopped bending to keep the peace when it cost me my own. When conflict arose, I addressed it calmly and directly. If someone couldn't meet me there, I let them go. That wasn't bitterness, it was self-respect. Marcus noticed the change before anyone else. He joked that I'd become intimidating, but there was pride in his voice. We'd sit on my couch watching old movies, and he'd tease me about how serious I'd gotten. I'd tease him back about how responsible he'd become. The truth was, we were both growing into ourselves, shaped by the same moment, pulled forward by it in different ways. One spring afternoon, Marcus called me with news that made me laugh out loud. He'd been approved for a small business loan. Nothing huge, but enough to get his idea off the ground. He'd been tinkering with it for years, fixing things on the side, dreaming about working for himself. He told me he'd almost talked himself out of applying, convinced he'd be rejected. I reminded him that he'd once stared down $5,000 he didn't have and said yes anyway. If he could do that, he could do this. When his business opened, modest and imperfect, I stood there on opening day, watching him greet customers, watching him stand taller than I'd ever seen him stand. Our parents came too. My father shook his hand, genuinely impressed. My mother hugged him tightly, her eyes shining. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that Marcus was finally being seen. Sadness that it had taken so much for that recognition to arrive. But life doesn't rewrite itself cleanly. It layers. It evolves. I accepted that. Over time, my relationship with my parents became something quieter, less charged. We spoke honestly when it mattered. We avoided old traps. I no longer expected them to be my emotional safety net, and because of that, I wasn't disappointed when they weren't. Instead, I appreciated what they could give: consistency, interest, a kind of love that was real, if limited. That shift allowed me to show up for them, too, without resentment. When my mother asked for help navigating a new technology, or my father needed a ride to an appointment, I did it willingly, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Choice makes all the difference. Marcus and I talked once about whether he regretted what he did, about the money, the stress, the sacrifices. He looked at me like I'd asked if he regretted breathing. He said the only thing he regretted was not having more to give at the time. I told him that was exactly why what he gave mattered. He didn't argue, he just smiled. Watching him build his business, watching him trust himself more, I understood that generosity doesn't deplete the generous, it reveals them. It had revealed Marcus to himself, and in doing so, it had changed the trajectory of his life just as much as it had changed mine. As for me, I found myself drawn to mentoring, to helping others navigate hard choices, especially around family and boundaries. I spoke from experience, not theory. I told people it was okay to grieve what you didn't get, even while appreciating what you did. That love doesn't have to look a certain way to be valid, but it does have to be consistent. Those conversations felt like honoring what I'd been given, passing it forward in my own way. Every so often, I still feel a flicker of sadness when I think about that kitchen table, about how easily my parents said no. But it no longer defines my story. It's just one chapter. The larger story is about a brother who said yes when it mattered most, about a bond forged in fear and sealed in action. It's about learning that sometimes the people you're taught to worry about are the ones who will save you, and the people you're taught to rely on may falter. That truth doesn't have to harden you. It can deepen you if you let it. Today, when I look at my life, I don't see it in terms of what was denied. I see it in terms of what was given. I see resilience, loyalty, courage. I see a brother who taught me the purest definition of love. And I see a version of myself who finally understands her own worth, not because of who approved of her, but because of who stood beside her when approval was nowhere to be found. As the year stretched on, the story of what happened didn't fade, but it did soften around the edges, like a photograph handled often enough that the sharp corners wear down. It became part of who we were, not something we constantly revisited, but something that quietly informed every decision we made. Marcus's business grew slowly, steadily, the way real things tend to grow. He learned the hard way about taxes, about unreliable suppliers, about trusting his instincts when something felt off. Each challenge seemed to refine him rather than break him. I watched with a kind of protective pride, the same way he once watched over me in a hospital room. We'd swap updates over dinner, laughing at setbacks, celebrating small wins. There was no envy between us, no competition, just shared momentum. Our parents attended one of Marcus's milestones a few years in, a small expansion, a ribbon cutting that felt ceremonial in the best way. I stood off to the side and watched them take photos, heard my father tell someone how proud he was of his son. I didn't feel angry hearing it. I felt complete. Pride isn't diminished by arriving late, it's just different. That moment wasn't about them making up for anything, it was about Marcus receiving something he deserved, on his own terms. My own life unfolded in ways that felt aligned, intentional. I formed deeper friendships, the kind built on mutual vulnerability rather than convenience. I traveled when I could, not extravagantly, but meaningfully, seeking places that reminded me the world was larger than the rooms where I'd once felt trapped. I carried my brother's example with me everywhere, a quiet standard against which I measured my own choices. When people asked me what I valued most, I said honesty, reliability, kindness when it's inconvenient. Those weren't abstract ideals, they were lived truths. One summer, Marcus faced a setback that tested him more than anything before. A key piece of equipment failed, threatening weeks of lost income. He called me late, frustration heavy in his voice. For the first time in a long while, I heard doubt creep in. Without hesitation, I offered to help cover the repair. This time, he didn't resist. He thanked me, openly, without shame. The ease of that exchange struck me. We had learned how to give and receive without it becoming a referendum on worth. That, to me, felt like the truest sign of healing. Our parents learned from us too, I think, not in dramatic declarations, but in observation. They started showing up differently, asking more questions, listening longer. When my mother faced a difficult decision about her own health, she involved us early, sought our input. Trust, once fractured, was being rebuilt slowly, cautiously. I didn't mistake that for a full transformation, but I respected the effort. Effort matters. It's how change begins. I often reflect on how close I came to delaying that surgery, to letting fear and finances dictate my future. The thought still makes my chest tighten. That path would have narrowed my world in ways I can only guess at. Instead, I stepped into uncertainty and was met with a love I hadn't expected. That contrast sharpened my sense of gratitude. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that informs how you live. Gratitude that becomes responsibility. Responsibility to honor what was given by living well, by being present, by choosing courage when it's easier to choose comfort. Marcus and I marked milestones together, not with extravagance, but with intention. A shared meal, a long conversation, a moment of acknowledgement. On the 10th anniversary of my surgery, we sat together and talked about how much had changed. He joked that it felt like another lifetime. I agreed, but I also felt how present it still was in me, not as pain, but as clarity. That experience had stripped away illusions and left something solid in their place. As I tell this story now, I'm aware that not everyone has a Marcus. Not everyone receives that kind of unequivocal support. I don't take it lightly. I know how rare it is. But I also know that sometimes people become that support for each other, forging family where it didn't exist before. The lesson isn't that blood guarantees loyalty, it's that loyalty is a choice, one made visible through action. My parents and I exist now in a relationship defined by realism rather than expectation. We care for each other within understood limits. That understanding prevents disappointment and allows genuine connection. It's not the relationship I once imagined, but it's an honest one. And honesty, I've learned, is a form of respect. When I look at Marcus now, confident, capable, still kind, I see the full arc of who he is, not the struggling younger brother, not the family liability, but a man shaped by generosity, strengthened by responsibility, and grounded in love. Knowing that I played a part in that journey, just as he played a part in mine, fills me with a quiet, enduring pride. Our story isn't about blame or bitterness, it's about recognition, about seeing clearly who people are when the stakes are high, about understanding that sometimes the most meaningful gifts come from the least expected hands, and about carrying that understanding forward, letting it shape not just one moment, but a lifetime of choices. There's a strange thing that happens when you survive something that could have gone very differently. Time doesn't erase it. Instead, it gives it dimension. I started noticing how often my thoughts circled back to that season, not with fear, but with curiosity. What if my parents had said yes? Would Marcus and I have ever become who we are now? That question didn't come from bitterness. It came from understanding that hardship, while never something I'd wish for, had carved out space for truth. And truth has a way of rearranging priorities in the most honest way possible. Marcus and I talked about that once during a long drive, the road stretching out in front of us, the radio low. He said he'd wondered the same thing. If our parents had stepped in, he might have stayed on the sidelines of my life, cheering quietly, never knowing what he was capable of. That thought sat with me for a long time. It didn't excuse their choice, but it contextualized the outcome. Growth rarely arrives through comfort alone. My parents aged in visible ways over those years, slower movements, more caution, more reflection. They began telling stories differently, lingering on moments they once rushed past. I listened more than I spoke. When my mother talked about her regrets, she never named the surgery, but it hovered between us. I didn't need her to say it out loud. The acknowledgement lived in her pauses, in the way she held my hand a little longer than before. Sometimes accountability isn't spoken, sometimes it's lived quietly. I learned to recognize that too. Marcus became someone people sought out for advice. Friends, coworkers, even distant relatives who once dismissed him now leaned in, curious about how he'd built something from so little. I watched him navigate that attention with humility. He never rewrote history to make himself look better. He told the truth. He said he'd been scared. He said he'd failed a lot. And he said he'd learned what mattered when someone he loved needed him. That honesty drew people in. It reminded me that authenticity isn't polished, it's raw and relatable. In my own life, I found myself less afraid of conflict. When misunderstandings arose, I addressed them directly, calmly, without the old panic that once accompanied confrontation. I knew now that disagreement didn't equal abandonment. I had proof of that. That knowledge changed everything. It made me braver, not louder, but steadier. Steadiness is underrated. It doesn't demand attention, but it holds everything together. One afternoon, sorting through old paperwork, I found the hospital bill, long since paid, tucked into a folder I hadn't opened in years. I sat on the floor and stared at it for a long time. $5,000, such a small number on paper, such a massive turning point in reality. I thought about how easily money becomes a symbol for deeper values: security, control, trust, fear, love. That bill represented all of it. I didn't shred it right away. I held on to it a bit longer, not out of pain, but out of respect for what it marked. Eventually, I let it go. Some reminders serve their purpose and then can be released. Marcus and I continued our anniversary breakfasts, though they evolved over time. Sometimes they were quick coffee stops, sometimes long, indulgent meals. Once we skipped breakfast entirely and went for a walk instead, letting the morning unfold slowly. That year, he thanked me. When I asked for what, he said for trusting him back then, for letting him help. That surprised me. I'd always framed that moment as him saving me, but I understood then that accepting help had been its own act of vulnerability. It had told him he mattered, that his contribution counted. Love flows both ways, even when it looks one-sided from the outside. My parents attended that breakfast one year at Marcus's invitation. It was awkward at first, the weight of history sitting heavily at the table, but something softened as the conversation went on. My father listened more than he spoke. My mother laughed freely. There was no grand reconciliation, no speeches, just presence, just shared time. Sometimes healing looks like that, not dramatic, just real. I noticed afterward that Marcus seemed lighter, not because he needed their approval, but because he no longer carried the question of whether they could show up at all. They had, in their way, late, imperfect, but present. That mattered. As I reflect on everything now, I see how easy it would be to tell this story as a simple moral tale, parents bad, brother good. But life is rarely that clean. My parents loved me. They still do. They made a choice rooted in fear, not malice. Marcus made a choice rooted in love, not logic. Both choices had consequences. The difference is that one expanded possibility and the other narrowed it. That's the lesson I carry forward. When faced with a decision, I ask myself which direction it moves me in, toward openness or contraction, toward connection or preservation, toward love or fear. The answer isn't always easy, but it's always revealing. I don't tell this story to assign blame. I tell it to illuminate something essential about human relationships, about how we show up, about how we decide what matters when resources are limited and stakes are high, about how sometimes the people we underestimate rise to meet us in ways that redefine our understanding of family. Marcus didn't just give me money, he gave me a mirror, reflecting back a version of myself worthy of care. That reflection stayed with me long after the scars faded. It shaped how I love, how I forgive, how I choose, and for that, no amount of money could ever compare. There came a time when the story stopped feeling like something that had happened to me and started feeling like something I carried for others. I didn't notice the shift at first. It showed up quietly in conversations where people leaned in a little closer when I spoke, in moments when someone confessed something heavy and looked relieved when I didn't rush to fix it. I realized that surviving something like that, being let down and lifted up in the same breath, had changed the way I listened. I listened without judgment, without urgency. I listened the way Marcus had listened to me the night I told him everything, steady and present. That, I learned, is a gift too. Marcus's business reached a point where he could finally hire help. The day he told me, his voice sounded different. Not louder, not prouder, just settled. He said it felt strange to be responsible for someone else's livelihood. I reminded him that he'd been carrying responsibility long before he had a business. That responsibility didn't start with money or titles. It starts with care. He nodded, quiet on the other end of the line, absorbing that. Watching him step into leadership made me think about how often we underestimate people based on where they are instead of who they are. Marcus had always been capable. He just hadn't been trusted. Trust, once given, had transformed him. My parents continued aging into a gentler version of themselves. My father apologized once, unexpectedly, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. He didn't mention the money or the surgery directly. He said he wished he'd been braver sometimes. I knew what he meant. I accepted it without dissecting it. Not every apology needs to be precise to be sincere. That moment didn't erase the past, but it eased something in both of us. Afterward, I felt lighter, not because he'd finally said the right thing, but because I no longer needed him to. There was a season when Marcus and I talked about the idea of legacy, not in terms of wealth or property, but in terms of impact. What do people remember about you when things are hard? Who do you become under pressure? Those questions felt more relevant than anything we'd been taught growing up. Marcus said he wanted to be the kind of person people felt safe calling when they were scared. I told him he already was. He laughed, uncomfortable with praise, but he didn't deflect it the way he used to. Growth looks like that sometimes, letting good things land. I thought about my own legacy too. I realized that before the surgery, I'd been living carefully, cautiously, trying to do everything right. Afterward, I lived more honestly. I said what I meant. I loved more openly. I risked being misunderstood. That shift didn't make life easier, but it made it truer. There's a difference. I stopped measuring success by how little trouble I caused and started measuring it by how present I was for the people who mattered. One evening, long after everything had settled, Marcus and I sat on my balcony again, the same place where we'd once unpacked old wounds. The city hummed below us, familiar and distant at the same time. He asked me if I ever wished things had gone differently. I thought about it carefully. I said I wished I hadn't been sick, I wished I hadn't been scared, but I didn't wish away what he'd done. I didn't wish away the clarity it gave me. Pain isn't something to romanticize, but neither is it something to deny its lessons. That balance felt important to name. As the years stacked up, my health remained stable, something I never took for granted. Every checkup felt like a quiet victory. I'd text Marcus afterward, a simple all clear message, and he'd respond with a thumbs up or a joke about how he expected nothing less. Those small exchanges carried more meaning than grand gestures ever could. They were proof of continuity, of life moving forward without forgetting where it had been. I noticed how my parents interacted with Marcus differently too. There was more respect now, more listening. They asked his opinion. They deferred to his judgment in practical matters. It wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. Consistency is how trust rebuilds itself, slowly, repeatedly, without fanfare. I didn't need them to acknowledge the past explicitly anymore. Their present behavior told me enough. I sometimes think about people who might be listening to this story and wondering what it means for them, wondering if they're wrong for feeling hurt, wondering if they're ungrateful for noticing where love fell short. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that two things can be true at once. You can love your family and still be wounded by them. You can appreciate what they gave and grieve what they couldn't. Naming that doesn't make you disloyal, it makes you honest. Marcus once told me that giving me that money forced him to see himself differently. He said he stopped thinking of himself as someone who was always catching up and started thinking of himself as someone capable of showing up. That shift mattered more than the financial strain. Hearing that changed how I understood the moment. It wasn't just about me being saved, it was about him stepping into his own strength. Sometimes helping someone else reveals your own power. As I look back now, I don't frame my parents' refusal as the defining act of my life. It was a catalyst, not a conclusion. The defining act was my brother's generosity and the chain of choices that followed it. The way we both chose to grow instead of harden. The way we allowed the experience to deepen us rather than divide us. That's what stayed. If I could speak to my younger self, the one sitting in that car outside the doctor's office, panicked and overwhelmed, I wouldn't promise her that everything would be okay. I'd tell her something better. I'd tell her she wouldn't face it alone. I'd tell her love would show up not where she expected, but exactly where she needed it. And that discovery would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The story didn't end with the surgery. It didn't end with repayment or apologies or success. It continues in every choice I make to prioritize people over comfort, connection over fear. It continues every time Marcus and I laugh about how far we've come. It continues in the quiet confidence of knowing what matters when things get hard. And that, more than anything, is the gift my broke brother gave me. Not just survival, but direction. There's a certain quiet that comes after a story is fully settled into your bones. Not silence exactly, but a steadiness. That's where I am now when I think about everything that happened. The fear has faded, the anger softened. Even the sadness has transformed into something gentler, something reflective. What remains is clarity, the kind you don't argue with anymore. Marcus and I don't talk about the money much these days, not because it's forgotten, but because it no longer needs words. It lives in the way we show up for each other instinctively, in the way he texts me when he knows I have a big meeting, even though I never told him the date, in the way I keep an extra set of keys to his place without either of us making a big deal out of it. Trust like that doesn't announce itself. It just exists, solid and unremarkable in the best way. My parents are older now, slower, more careful with their energy. I see them differently too, not as villains, not as heroes, just as people shaped by their own fears and values, some of which protected them, some of which cost them closeness. I no longer need them to fully understand the depth of what that moment meant to me. Understanding isn't always required for healing. Sometimes acceptance is enough. There was a day not long ago when my mother asked me how I'd want to be remembered. It was an unexpected question, asked casually while we were folding laundry together. I didn't answer right away. I thought about it. Then I said, I wanted to be remembered as someone who showed up, someone who didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away somewhere important. I didn't ask what she wanted. I already knew. Marcus and I still keep our anniversary tradition, though now we call it something different. Not a surgery anniversary, not a rescue story, just a reminder day, a reminder of who we are to each other. This year we didn't even mention the past directly. We talked about his plans, my hopes, small annoyances, future dreams, but when we hugged goodbye, there was an unspoken understanding there. We both knew what that day meant, even without naming it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the moments that define us rarely come with warning. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary decisions, a yes or a no, a step forward or a step back. My parents made a choice that protected what they valued most. Marcus made a choice that risked everything he had. Both choices revealed something true about them, about me, about what kind of world we were living in and what kind of world we wanted to help create. I used to think love was something you felt, something warm and reassuring. Now I know it's something you do, something that costs you time, comfort, security, something that asks you to act before you're certain, before you feel ready. Marcus didn't wait until he had enough. He acted with what he had. That lesson has shaped every meaningful decision I've made since. When people hear my story, they sometimes ask if I resent my parents. The honest answer is no. Resentment requires ongoing expectation, and I've released that. What I feel instead is discernment. I know who they are. I know what they can and cannot give. That knowledge keeps me grounded. It allows me to love them without asking them to be someone else. I also know who Marcus is. I know that if everything fell apart tomorrow, he would show up. Not perfectly, not without fear, but fully. And he knows the same about me. That mutual certainty is rare. It's a privilege, one I protect fiercely. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine an alternate version of myself, one who never asked for help, one who delayed the surgery, one who let pride or fear make the decision. I don't dwell there long. That path feels distant now, like a story that belongs to someone else. But I honor that version of me too. She was doing the best she could with what she knew at the time. What I know now is this: worth isn't determined by who refuses you. It's revealed by who chooses you, over and over again. My brother chose me when it was inconvenient, when it was risky, when it cost him something real. And in doing so, he didn't just change the outcome of my surgery, he changed the trajectory of our lives. He changed how I understand love, family, and myself. So when I say my parents refused $5,000 for my surgery, that's only the beginning of the story. The heart of it is this: the person everyone worried about, the one labeled irresponsible, the one with nothing extra to give, became the reason I survived, healed, and grew. Family isn't who tells you they love you when it's easy, it's who proves it when it's hard. And I will spend the rest of my life honoring that truth.